My brain made me do it. Learning the brain and consciousness-based education. In considering the relationship of the brain to learning, let's start with a student. This is my first slide. Students, they come from different historical backgrounds, different language, religious, and cultural traditions. We'll continue with this slide. Different social pressures. Different cultural and language groups, completely different from those in the U.S. Students just come with completely different levels of experience. However, students do have one thing in common. That is, they see with their eyes, they hear with their ears, that information becomes a picture in the back of their brain. That picture in the back of the brain is tied into time and space and values and meaning and goals with the front of the brain. Brain functioning is common to all students. Brain functioning is the common denominator of all learning. So in my next slide, let's look at the brain. Here we see the brain is divided in two, left and right. The left side has more short-range connections. That's analysis and synthesis. The yellow dot here is a circuit, the pleasure circuit. We're diving into the brain now. We see the brain doesn't have a crystalline structure, but it's a mass, a network of interconnected neurons. That white stripe coming down is an action potential, information coming down one neuron. It turns into neurotransmitters, chemicals, as we see here in the space between, and then it's received by the other side. And this is where the magic of learning happens. It's called the synapse. When you use these connections, what happens is the synapses strengthen. The receiving end becomes thicker, the sending end more readily takes in data. However, if you don't use these circuits, they actually disappear. They're reabsorbed by the cell. So this is the overview of learning, but there's some important details of the brain we need to understand, and that's my next slide. And that is, when we are born, our brains are unassembled. Here we see the surface of the brain as a newborn. The triangles that we see here are the cell bodies. These here are cell bodies. These lines are input fibers. Let's look what happens at the brain at 3 months. Not much change. Let's look at 6 months. See what's happened. There's a huge interconnection which has begun. In the first 3 years of life, the brain actually makes 24 million new connections every minute. 24 million new connections every minute. And this is how the child is able to see, to hear, to organize an understanding of the world, to gain control of their body. Let's look at our next slide. It shows how these connections between the brain change over time. On the bottom, the horizontal axis, the x-axis, we have time in years. On the y-axis, we have number of connections. Each dot is a person, and what we see here is a line which shows that connections initially go up to a high level at about age 3. They remain high to about age 10, and then there's a process of pruning that goes on. The connections you've used maintain, the connections you haven't used drop off. And there's something else which is happening, and that is myelination. What it is a fatty layer is being added to the output fiber. It speeds up brain transmission 20 times. So what does that mean? In the first 3 years of life, it's the sensory systems which are myelinating. And so what we find is the senses are that which develop first in the brain. Then between 5 and 10, it's the right and left sides of the brain. The left side that has to do more with analytical processes, the right side with wholeness, they begin to come together and the child can begin to think. And then we have connections between the front and the back of the brain. This happens in the later teenage years. The front of the brain is the executive center. It literally gets information from all of the parts of the brain. It feeds into the front. The front decides what's important, and then it feeds back. It's this important integrative functioning, these circuits, which begin to grow at age 12 and continue up to age 25. That means a 16, 17, 18-year-old is still very concrete in their thinking. They have to grasp any abstractions in terms of very concrete instances. So these are two instances of how the brain is changing. This is a third, my next slate, and it's experience changes the brain. If you copy anything down from my talk, please copy down these 5 words. Experience changes the brain. There's actually just 4 there. Experience changes the brain. The brain, it's a river and not a rock. 70% of brain connections change every day. We're going to be looking at that. Here we have input fibers. These fibers here, and each bump that you see here is a place where other neurons are talking to this one. I've drawn some in just so you can see what it's like. This is the dense entanglement of the brain. Now let's see how these change over 8 days. We're going to see 8 successive pictures, and each one is the connections in this area. And what you want to do is just notice how these bumps arise and then disappear. So here we go. So I'll do this again. Notice you have areas here which come up and then are reabsorbed. This is what's happening with every experience. This is what's happening with education. What education is doing is actually strengthening specific circuits. When you are looking at math, that way of thinking, that way of seeing the world, when you are in science, when you're in literature, what you're doing is you're strengthening specific connections in your brain, allowing you to see the world more clearly, understand the world more thoroughly. So let's go to my next slide. This is going to be some audience participation. I want you to pick an integer. Integer is one of the counting numbers. Double it. Multiply by 8. Divide by 3. Now, this is what was happening in your brain. What was happening is the back part of the brain was being used, and the front part of the brain is being used. What the back part of the brain was doing was putting together the new number, and that new number was being maintained here in the front part of the brain. So now, I would like you to ask which of these are most aesthetically pleasing. This one, or this one. Now, this is an actual sculpture. The middle one was the actual middle sculpture. And if you look at the dimensions, it's the dimensions of the golden mean. Most people pick the middle one as that which is most aesthetically pleasing. And the next slate shows which part of your brain was active then. What we see here is the back left part of the brain. The back part of the brain is where you actually create a picture. You put together all the information coming from all the parts of the brain, and you make a concrete picture of what's here and now. And we see when you make an aesthetic sense, you use a specific part of the back for that one. Okay, for my next slide, you've just gotten into your philosophy class now, and you're asked to make an ethical judgment. Is it right to steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving person? I'd like to think about this for a moment. Okay, this is the part of your brain that was active. Notice it's very specified, and notice it's in the front of the brain. This is a top-down that we're seeing here, and the left on the other side. This is the front of the brain. Again, the front of the brain is your executive processor. It takes in concrete information and it thinks about it abstractly. This is a part of the brain which actually begins to become more online as you mature in your middle and late 20s. And this is some aspects of how education is affecting your brain, but there is one other aspect, and that's my next slide, and that is just not only the class content, but what about the class environment, the school environment. When you're under stress, it leads to the fight or flight response. In the fight or flight response, the back of your brain, your sensory experience, and your motor system become active. What the brain has done is prepared itself to either fight or run away. Notice the CEO, the chief executive officer, this executive part of the brain is actually offline under stress. It's the same way during fatigue. And so you know how hard it is to remember a name when you're under stress. It's because that part of the brain that can actually go to the memory system and pick it up is suddenly offline because of that stressful experience. Now, what are these classes doing to the students' brains? I'd like to think a moment. What are the classes that activate this localized area, then this localized area, then that localized area? What are they doing to the brain? What is stress doing to the brain? What is fatigue doing to the brain? What it's doing is it's activating local areas of the brain. You can become good in one thing, perhaps good in math, but it won't help you to become good in art, to become good in literature, like that. Just localized areas are being active. What we need is a new experience. And what this new experience is, as we see in my next slide, is an experience which will actually activate the entire brain. This is what we get with transcendental meditation practice. Transcendental meditation practice leads to a state called restful alertness. It's actually the ground state of the mind, where the mind is quiet, alert, awake. Not actively thinking, worrying, deciding, but just being, just awake. And during transcendental meditation practice, we find that the attentional system, remember the CEO, the front part of the brain, which disappeared under stress, is actually enlivened, becoming more active during TM practice. At the same time, the core of the brain is more restful. What is happening is the whole brain is becoming quiet, and when this happens, the front and the back of the brain can begin to communicate. The total brain can begin to become lively in itself. I'd like to show you in my next slides a series of coherence maps. What we see here are a series of heads. The dots on the heads are where we record the EEG. A line between the dots means those two parts of the brain are working together. We have three columns of heads. Gamma, the right, is that high frequency that's active when you're really focused. The middle frequency, beta, is just that level of EEG frequency, which is there when you're putting things together. And then we have alpha on the left. This is that state of restful alertness that we talked about during TM practice. So this is a person eyes open. They're doing a demanding task. Notice on the right there's quite a bit of coherence in gamma because they're focusing in. They're in a very localized experience at that point. Now let's look at the same person. This is 5 seconds later. This is 5 seconds later again. Each of these are very similar, where there's a lot of activity in the high frequency because localized parts of the brain are active. Now this person puts down their button press response, and they close their eyes, they begin TM practice, and looks what happens. Do you see that? First thing we notice, this is just the first 5 seconds of TM practice. First we see the gamma coherence is gone because there's no longer that localized focus processing. And notice the front of the brain is beginning to become more coherent, more integrated with itself. That's the first 5 seconds. This is the next 5 seconds. Notice what's happening is the coherence is becoming now more symmetrical on left and right. Here we have next 5 seconds. We see this coherence is beginning to spread to the back. And here we have 30 seconds into the meditation. The frontal area is highly integrated with itself. And at the same time, we see that coherence is spread to the back. The whole brain is awake, is alert, is working as one. My next slide will show the actual electrical activity going on. This is what you see in a person's brain when they practice the TM technique. What we have here is 8 seconds of data. We have the front, the middle, and the back of the brain. Here we have 1 second. Notice the very rhythmical rising and falling. That's that alpha activity that we're speaking about. Seeing when the brain is just restful and alert. And notice it's seen in all the leads. This is what we mean by total brain functioning. The whole brain is beginning to function as itself. But just to make it clear, it's not that the whole brain is active, is doing things, but rather the whole brain is awake. The foundation for doing is now awake, coherent. The foundation for thinking, feeling, experiencing is now awake, coherent. And so what it can do is take localized experiences and put them together into greater wholenesses. And what's the value of this? That's right, those 4 words, experience changes the brain. Let's see how the brain changes as you continue to meditate. That's my next slide. In this slide, we see 2 individuals. The one on the left has been meditating for 4 months. The one on the right has been meditating for 8 years. What we see again is front is in the very top, middle, back. We've condensed the time, so this is the alpha activity, the alpha activity that we were referring to. You notice you see it in the back. You see it also here in the center, also in the front. Now, look at these two, and do you see any difference during TM practice in a 4-month and an 8-month meditator? 8-year meditator? There isn't any. That's right. I looked for 3 months. I'm a scientist, a little slow. And I thought, well, it doesn't make sense. Someone meditating for 8 years, certainly they must get better at it. But after looking at the data in every possible way, it became very clear that during the TM practice itself, there was no difference. And that's because the TM technique uses the natural tendency of the mind. The way the mind settles down from active thinking to the ground state of the mind is propelled by its own natural tendency to expand, to evolve, to grow, to go towards more and more. That natural tendency of the mind is what you've been experiencing during this 15-minute talk so far. Even though you're very interested, you want to get all of these details. What may have happened is your mind thought, I wonder where we'll be going for dinner. I wonder who's winning the baseball game. I wonder if I have time to read a book. The mind is always going towards more and more. It's going outwards, looking for greater knowledge, greater understanding. This same natural tendency of the mind is what takes the mind from active thinking to the silence of pure consciousness. That's why someone meditating for 4 months, the brain waves, the inner state of silence would be the same as someone meditating for 8 years. But there is a difference, which is seen in my next slide, and that's during tasks. On the left, that's the person who's been meditating for 4 months. On the right is the person who's been meditating for 8 years. You notice the person on the right. Here's their EEG during TM. Here's their brain waves during task. You see what's happening? The EEG patterns during meditation are now seen during the task. This is experience changing the brain, just moving the brain back and forth from meditation to activity, meditation to activity. What is happening is the brain begins to integrate those two. Those restfully alert circuits, total brain functioning circuits, begin to be maintained along with the ability to focus. And now we have 200% of life, our ability to think deeply. But at the same time, this thinking deeply is based upon a very broad picture of awareness. Let's look again at this changing during meditation in activity, seen in my next slide. This is a 1-year longitudinal study. And what we see at the top, these are individuals, MUM students, came to MUM before they learned to meditate. So what we see here is what is their coherence in the front when they're just sitting with eyes closed. They haven't learned to meditate yet. And then when they're doing a task. Now look, 2 months later they came in. Notice how the coherence during TM rises to a high level. But also notice during the task, the coherence during the task is also increasing. Now this is the important one. 6 months later, notice the coherence during TM practice remains at that very high level, while coherence during the task continues to increase. We see then again at 12 months. So what we have here is an important addition to education. It's important not only to have skills and knowledge, but it's important to develop the underlying brain circuitry, the underlying brain coherence, integration, to allow you to put things together in a meaningful way. So here at Maharishi University of Management, you can get 2 report cards. One is your GPA with your A's from math, and the next is, my next slide, is the Brain Integration Progress Report. Now what we have on the left here is the data, published data, showing how brain integration grows from non-meditating individuals, that's those individuals on the left, to those who have been experiencing this ground state of the mind, practicing TM for 24 years or longer. And they report the permanent integration of inner silence with outer activity. So what we do is we give the chance for all first-year students to have their brain recorded, and this is during tasks, complex tasks, as freshmen and then again as seniors. And then they can see what the college has done to their brain. High scores on this brain integration report card, as seen in my next slide, correlate with higher moral reasoning, greater emotional stability, openness to experience. It's inversely correlated with state and trait anxiety. Inversely correlated means higher levels of brain integration, lower levels of anxiety. So we've actually applied this at American University. 50 American University students came, were pre-tested, and then half of them, that's this periwinkle blue group, learned TM immediately. The other half, the plum group, had to wait to the end of the semester. So at the end of the semester, those individuals who learned the TM practice actually increased in brain integration. Those that did not actually decreased in brain integration. Now, this decrease in brain integration is the known effect of stress and fatigue on the brain. And just so you can really appreciate these results, pre-test was at the beginning of the semester, post-test was just before finals week. It was actually the week before finals week. It's the time of maximum pressure, stress on the individual. And we see that TM practice was a buffer for that very stressful, demanding time of students. And it was so much a buffer that they actually were able to grow, not only just cope, sort of keep even, but actually continue to grow through the demands of school. So on my next slide, we've seen that classroom learning enlivens isolated brain areas. The experience of transcendental consciousness during TM practice enlivens the total brain. So add TM practice to your curriculum and enliven the basis of learning and success in life. I'd like to leave you with a visual picture here. Everyone recognize the picture? That's right, it's the Wizard of Oz. And notice the Wizard of Oz is giving a piece of paper to the Scarecrow. Now, what did the Scarecrow want? Do you remember? That's right, the Scarecrow wanted a brain. But let's go back to that slide and see what the wizard is giving him. The wizard is giving him a piece of paper. My advice to you is that you deserve more than a piece of paper from school. You deserve integrated brain functioning, which would be the basis of broad thinking, very focused activity, very broad planning, so you can be most successful in everything that you do. Thank you for your attention.